Happy Sunday again, everybody. Once again, it's me, Pastor Brian here. I am not at church this week. By the time you watch this, I will be enjoying a Labor Day weekend, brief Labor Day weekend vacation with my family, who it might be the last chance I get to see them before the holiday season. We have a guest preacher preaching at the outdoor services today, and she always does a fantastic job. So if you get a chance, if you watch this before you get up and go, I encourage you to go and listen to our guest preacher, Judy, preach, because she does a fantastic job. She is going to be doing exactly what I am doing today. Our messages will be slightly different. So even if you watch this one, if you still want to go to the outdoor services at either Mancelona or Alba, you are still welcome to do that at any time. We meet outdoors at Alba at 9:30 in the morning and at Mancelona at 11. So please feel free to go. We continue our series on Paul's playlist. That is, if Paul were alive today and writing this letter to a church that he was developing in this day and age, what songs might he have been listening to gain inspiration to figure out what he wanted to say to the church members in that church? And overall, as we've said numerous times before in this video series, the main issue that Paul sees in the church in Corinth is that they are starting to show signs of division. They're starting to show signs of separation. They're getting into arguments about which teachers they should listen to. They're getting into debates and discussions about which group has the right beliefs, which group has the right practices. Everything in 1 Corinthians ties into this division. And so Paul, as he's writing, he's not only warning against the division, but he is also giving practical advice. He's giving examples on how some of the potential ways that the church members can remain unified in these divisive times. And when we get to this passage in chapter 8, he starts shifting to more practical advice. It would appear that the church in Corinth at the time, one of the big issues that they had was whether or not it was okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. Now, Corinth was about as pagan of a city as you could get in the Roman times. It was a mecca for all different kinds of worship and different religious beliefs, and many of us today would see that as a blessing. At the time, the church in Corinth saw that as kind of a curse because they kept seeing this outside influence flooding into, and in some instances, corrupting the community that they were trying to build. And one of the ways it was doing that was with meat that was being sacrificed to false gods. The people who were sacrificing it, of course, didn't think that those gods were false, but to the church in Corinth, they certainly were. Now, you can look through the scriptures of the Old Testament and you can see many things about sacrifices. It was one of the primary ways that the people of the Old Testament worshiped God was by sacrificing animals. And even in Jesus' own life, his family was a part of that sacrificial system. They would have to go and sacrifice at certain points during the year in an attempt to appease God or to find favor from God. And many pagan religions, as Paul would understand them, did the same thing. The taboo for the community came with regards to whether or not it was okay to eat the meat that had been sacrificed. See, they didn't just burn up the meat and throw it all away. They would offer up the meat and they would then sell it to people so that they could eat it at home, so they could eat it as part of religious festivals. And some of the members in the church thought this was a bad idea. Other members of the church thought it didn't matter. And what we see here really are two conflicting sides of the coin. Right? They're two conflicting sides of the coin. On the one hand, Paul sides with the people that he thinks are right? He knows, as well as some of the people in the church in Corinth know, that if you believe there is only one God, then all of those other gods that people are supposedly worshiping can't exist or exist on a lower level than God. So in that sense, if that is what you believe, then the meat being sacrificed is just meat, just like anything else. And that's what Paul believes. However, the caveat to that comes because there is a group that is potentially relatively new to the faith life, a group that maybe grew up sacrificing meat to idols, a group who is new to the Christian faith, who still views it as being offered to gods. They're not that far along in their faith journey yet where they have made that theological connection between there only being one God, and therefore that means that there are no other gods. So when those newer members see the more advanced members participating, there is a possibility that they see that as them worshiping the other gods. So Paul's main advice to the church in Corinth today is that even if the knowledge that you have is right, even if the knowledge that you have you think is right or you know to be true, it doesn't supersede love of neighbor. It never comes before love of neighbor, right? Paul is going to continue this train of thought as he goes through this book, but essentially what he's saying is, if anything that you do or anything that you say could potentially lead somebody else in the church family astray, you probably shouldn't do it. Because when it comes to knowledge versus love, love is always going to win. You know, our song for this week is a classic song. It was first, I think, recorded and released in 1972, and it's a song called Lean on Me by Bill Withers, who I found out over the course of this week died this year. He actually passed away in April of this year. And it's one of the most influential songs of the 20th century, arguably. And as I was doing research for this sermon, this message, I came across an interesting story as I was trying to figure out, well, where did he come up with the idea for this song? And it turns out he was born in a little mining town in West Virginia. I think it was called Slab Fork, West Virginia. And from a good chunk of his life, he lived in this rural community. And the thing, if you've never lived in a rural community, one of the big things you need to know about rural communities is that they're very interconnected. They're very interconnected. Everybody knows everybody's business, and that's either a good thing or a bad thing. Everybody's typically potentially related in some way, shape, or form, especially if you get to those older communities, but everybody is willing to stop what they're doing and help for the most part. It's a very contrasting way of life when you compare it to something like suburban life, which is what I'm used to. I grew up in the suburbs, or city life, where you have to intentionally form community as opposed to being a part of a community from the get-go. And Bill was raised in that mentality. And after high school, he went into the Marines. And after the Marines, he moved to LA. And while he was in LA, he was playing on the piano. And he just started kind of doing some basic notes, basic chords, basic melodies. And in fact, if you learn to play the piano, this is, from what I understand, one of the easiest songs you can learn how to play on the piano. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Doesn't involve a lot of hand movements if you don't want it to. But he was thinking about that sense of community and how he was missing it while he was out in Los Angeles. And that was part of the inspiration for the song. The other part of the song, the other inspiration for the song came while he was in the Marines. At a certain point in his Marine life, he said when he was 18 or 19 years old, he was stationed in Pensacola, Florida, which is way on the western side of the state, just south of Alabama. And he was planning on taking a drive back up to West Virginia to go spend the holidays with his family. And as he was driving through Alabama, now keep in mind this was back in 1958, 1959, height of the civil rights movement, or at least the early stages of it, where southern states weren't necessarily the most welcoming and even in some cases very dangerous for black men and women and families to travel through. As he's driving through Alabama, which in a couple of years would become one of the big hotbeds for the civil rights movement, he blew a tire and he didn't have a spare. And understandably, he was probably a little afraid, but he was in the Marines, so, he was at least a little physically strong, so he did have the potential to defend himself if the time came. And in his own words, as he was sitting there trying to figure out what to do in a time before cell phones and AAA, in a time before all the connections that we take for granted today, again, in his own words, a guy who looked straight out of Deliverance came walking over a hill, a white guy. And he started to get a little nervous. Again, he knew where he was. He knew what life was like in that place at that time. And the guy walked up to his car and he looked down at the car and he said, you blew a tire. And Bill said, yeah, I did. And the guy walked back over the hill. A couple minutes later, the guy comes back with a brand new tire. He helps Bill change the tire on his car, and he's able to continue the journey to his parents' house for the holidays. Love always supersedes knowledge. That's the message that Paul has today. See, it's not enough just to know everything in life. Our society is too hung up nowadays on who knows what and who is the most informational or who is the most knowledgeable person on a subject. In fact, in our own lives, and I'm just as guilty of this as everybody else, in our own lives, we can get so caught up in being right that we won't even listen to people that we know are wrong. And when we get caught up and we get puffed up in that sense, we tend to isolate rather than build. See, Paul believes that love is the key to understanding all of reality around us, and love is the only constructive force in the world in Paul's mind. Everything that is constructed that benefits people, at its cornerstone is love. It's done out of love in some way, shape, or form. Again, this is according to Paul. So if you think you're so knowledgeable about things to the point where you are openly criticizing people for their beliefs or openly criticizing them because they don't think the way that you think, it's contrary to love. And if it's contrary to love, it's a sin. Love supersedes knowledge. Even if you know better. Even if you think you're right, even if you know you're right, even if the facts back you up, according to Paul, if you do something that might hinder the journey of faith of somebody else, that's a sin. That is not a sin against the person. Paul says it's a sin against Christ. Now, it's hard to put this into a modern example because realistically, most of us do not run into meat sacrificed to idols on a regular basis. However, there are still people who do make sacrifices at idols, and specifically in Hinduism and Buddhism. Those are two religions where they do offer up food to their deities. And if you are in a relationship with somebody from that religion or know somebody from that religion, that is a real-world example of what Paul is talking about. But another example that's probably a little less controversial and therefore maybe a little more palatable to people who would be watching this today, is alcohol, right? Should a Christian consume alcohol? And you get people all over the map on this question, right? There are Christians in the world who are very against the use of alcohol. Pure abstinence. In fact, it was Christianity that was the main force behind the Prohibition movement back in the Roaring 20s and all of the stuff that came from that. There are some who say it's perfectly fine, but I'm willing to assume that many take a more moderational stance on it, in the sense that, one or two every once in a while is okay. Everything in moderation. We don't want to be excessive about it because that can lead to problems, but we don't outright want to have it banned for any reason. You'll find Christians all across the understanding spectrum on that issue. But to bring it into what Paul is saying, if you are a Christian who believes that it's okay to drink from time to time, and you are in a meeting or in a small group or in a congregation with someone who thinks it's okay or it's not okay, Paul says, what's it going to hurt to give it up? right? What's it going to hurt to give it up? If you've got somebody in your church who's been struggling with alcohol and maybe they've gone to AA meetings and maybe addiction is a big problem for them, what is it going to hurt to give it up while you're in their vicinity? What is it going to hurt to give it up in your own life? Because if they see you doing that, then they might think it's okay. And if they think it's okay, it leads to the potential for bad things to happen, right? Love should always be the top priority. It doesn't matter what you know. It doesn't matter how certain you are that you know what you know and that it's right. Love is always the top priority. And that's why I'm so grateful that we have a chance to listen to Bill Withers' song Lean on Me today, because underlying all of this and whether or not it's okay to eat meat offered up to idols, underlying all of this, Paul is still talking about building up relationships in the church, not dividing the church, but building up those relationships. And one of the fundamental ways that we can do that is to be there for one another, which is what that whole song, Lean on Me, is about, right? Just call on me when you need a hand. Don't hide your issues from your brothers and sisters. Open it up. Let them know if you're struggling. Let people know. You'll always find somebody who is willing to help. It's not good to think that you can solve all of your own problems by yourself. And honestly, you don't have to. Right? We're all here for one another. We're all trying to do our best to make it through these times. We're all doing everything that we can to be supportive of one another, or at least we should be. This should be a time where we can really lean on one another. And sometimes that means putting your knowledge aside. Sometimes that means admitting that you're not right. Sometimes that means that even if you know everything you think there is to know, there's still a lot more out there. In the days to come, especially as we prepare to go back to school up here, we're about a week and a half or so away from that in Mancelona and Alba. Let us remember that it is okay to lean on one another, that even if we think we're right, we can put that aside and still show love to the people that we disagree with. That love always comes before knowledge in the eyes of Christ. Let us pray. God of life and love, we give you thanks for this day, and we give you thanks for one another. For though there are many things that divide us, whether it be the knowledge that we have or the political positions that we take or the religious beliefs that we have, the underlying message that you brought into the world through your Son, Jesus Christ, is love. Love to the point of setting aside what we know and what we believe, that we might best help one another. Through Christ, you remind us that love takes priority over everything else in life. Watch over us in all of our endeavors, both this day and in the days to come, as we ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. It is my hope that you have a fantastic week this week. Again, if you want to listen to the playlist, it is available both on Spotify and on iTunes. I will provide the link in the description of the video. I have a great week. Remember that God loves you, that there is help out there if you need it, and I'll talk to you next time.